Okay. Okay, so we said last week that the Torah says, when the Torah is talking about the fruit of Shvius, it says, "V'hayasa Shabbos ha'aretz lechem la'achra," and it will be a Shabbos, a rest of the land for you to eat it. That means that you're allowed to eat the fruit, subject to the various conditions that we're learning. And the rabbis say, when it says to eat it, we infer from that two things. You can eat it, but you mustn't waste it or destroy it. You can eat, that's the fruit, the produce. You can eat the produce, but you mustn't trade in it. It's not for trade. So from here, we learn the laws of how, in fact, the produce is to be distributed and what are the limitations, etc., etc. An ordinary person who buys fruit from a store buys it to eat, but the storekeeper who buys fruit from a wholesaler doesn't buy it to eat, it's part of his trading. And in turn, the wholesaler who buys from the farmer is not buying it to eat, and the farmer himself is not growing it when he sells it. It's also part of trade. So all that is forbidden. It's forbidden for the produce of Shmitta. The produce of Shmitta must be acquired in a way other than sale or trade. And we should see as we go on the various ways in which this can be done. Because we have to eat. And the Torah says it's for eating. So let's go back a little bit. Now I have two very nice, a damson tree and a peach tree and a plum tree. So comes next year, the fruit of that tree, those trees will be the fruit, the produce of Shmitta. Because as I said, with trees, we go after the time of Chanata, which is the time when the flower falls off and you see the bud. All right, so that fruit is now Shmitta produce. What is the law? The law is that it's hefker, it's not mine, it doesn't belong to me. So anyone can come and pick it. There are a couple of limitations. One is how much can they pick? Generally, we would say that they should pick only enough, a reasonable amount, maybe 3 meals, a few plums for a few meals, etc., etc. They can't come with a crate and empty the whole lot. And what about how can they come into my land? My land is not hefker. So the answer is, even though my land is not hefker, I have to make it available for people. So anyone here who's listening to this class next year wants to come along to Meitzad and come to my garden, they don't need my permission to do it. However, if they were to bring up a whole crowd of people, kids or whatever, who might spoil my garden or my land, then I'm allowed, or if I was afraid that people would come in and try to seize the land, then I'm allowed to fence it, but I would have to put up a sign saying, even though the land is fenced, anyone who wants to come to the fruit can come and pick the fruit. They should phone me at such and such a number, or it'll be open in such and such a time. Okay. But that's not a practical way for a family to have the produce of Shmitta for the whole year. So then we come back to the central question. The central practical question is, what is the produce which has the law of the Kedusha of Shmitta? Is it only land and produce which is grown by Jews, or does it apply to all land and produce in Eretz Yisrael? So we said, but I have to say this over again because it's the key to understanding the practical aspects. There is a disagreement which is based on a Gemara as to whether if a non-Jew owns land in Eretz Yisrael and worships that land and works that land, does that produce have a din of Kedusha Shmit? If land owned or whatever owned, I'll say owned by Arabs and worked by Arabs, the produce of that land, does it have a din of Kedusha? And as I said before, the Jerusalem rabbis, based on the Shulchan Aruch, held that it did not. They hold that it did not. And the Bnei Brak rabbis held that it does. So that would mean if you were living in Jerusalem, and you go by the Jerusalem tradition, you can buy produce from Arabs without any restriction at all, in the same way as you can buy product from Arabs every other year. Not only can you buy products from Arabs, but you can buy Arab produce. In other words, if your local greengrocer, we say in England, if your local produce store buys from Arabs, you can go into the shop and buy that. And there is no issue, there's nothing forbidden about trade, because the law of trade, the issue of trading, only applies to Jews, doesn't apply to Arabs. As I said before, the Bnei Brak school held that, yes, that Arab produce does have Kedusha, and therefore we're going to have to explain a whole different system. Now, don't think that, well, the Bnei Brak, it's chumrah, it's good to take that, because there is a position to say, really, you should follow the custom, the minhag of the place you live in. And therefore, since in Jerusalem, the Arab produce was permitted, perhaps that applies today. However, as I said, more and more people nowadays do not follow that. I don't know how Rabbi Nebenzahl holds in the Rover, because he's the rabbi of the Rover. I don't know if he holds that Arab produce has or does not have Kedusha. One factor in the Rover is that the shops, there are a couple of shops, they were owned by Arabs. And we'll see in a moment that even if we hold there's Kedusha, it's possibly easier to buy from an Arab shopkeeper than a Jewish shop. All right, so now let's assume that Arab produce is, if we're holding like the Jerusalem system, that Arab produce is free from the laws of Shmitta. However, how do I know that it's Arab produce? Just because there's an Arab dealer who deals in vegetables, who sells produce and says this is from Arabs, how do I know that I can trust him? Perhaps he's buying his produce from an Israeli kibbutz or an Israeli agricultural producer and saying it's Arab produce to avoid this problem. So there's two possibilities. One is sometimes the crop is clearly Arab. There's certain kinds of vegetables and crops that we know the Jews don't sell in that way, or something. And it's a style of Arab. So if that's so, I know it's an Arab produce, that's all right, if I hold by that. Secondly, the Beis Din, which gives hechshers, including the Jerusalem system, which gives hechshers to Arab produce, and you'll see it says Nochui or some other term in the shop telling you that it's Arab produce. How do they know that it is indeed Arab produce and it wasn't bought from Jews? They used to send people into the fields to check it, but it's a little bit dangerous. And nowadays they have cameras. They have what do they call those things that are up in the air filming it? And someone told me that in the base din where they supervise this, they have a whole room of TV screens showing the produce being picked and delivered. So they're very strict on it. Oh, so now, if we're going to go by the Jerusalem system, that Arab-owned and marketed produce is okay, doesn't have Shmitta, so then that's okay. And you can buy from a store which has a supervision, a hechsher of the Jerusalem-based din or the local-based din, that it's all produce of non-Jews. But that doesn't mean that you can go into a supermarket or a store which doesn't have that hechsher, because then the probability is that the produce is from Jewish agriculturists sold under the heter mechira. And since I have said before that nowadays most religious people don't hold by the heter mechira, so then there's a problem, because that produce does have kedusha, and the shopkeeper is not allowed to sell it. And by your buying it, you're causing him to be over a kind of a misa. Now, the food itself, as I said before, is kosher. It's 100% kosher. God forbid, you mustn't think that it's trade. It's all kosher, and furthermore, it has kedusha shmita, but you shouldn't buy it from a store which doesn't have it. Okay. Now we have now, so let's say now that I have produce which does have kedusha shmita. So then there is a very interesting phenomenon. Law. If someone, let's say a shopkeeper, sells produce which has kedusha shmita, he receives money for that. So not only does the fruit that he sells have kedusha shmita, but the money that he receives for that fruit has kedusha shmita, even though it's not produce, didn't grow from the tree or from the ground or anything. But the money itself has kedusha shmita. What does that mean? That means that what I buy with that money also will have kedusha shmita. And then I get into an extraordinary thing. Let's say someone sells produce of shmita and he receives money. And he's an honest guy, a villager. He didn't know. Now he has this money which has kedusha shmita. What can he do with the money? Well, he can buy food and drink. Let's say he buys food, he buys fish. And let's say he buys a drink, he buys beer. That fish and that beer, since it's bought with kedusha shmita money, itself has kedusha shmita. The fish, even though it doesn't grow from the ground, doesn't grow from the tree, because it was bought with kedusha shmita money, is itself has the law of kedusha. That means you can't waste it, you're not supposed to trade with it, etc., etc. There's all kinds of problems, all difficult problems relating to that. So that's why, to avoid these problems, it's essential that during Shmita we buy from shopkeepers who have a hechsher that it is supervised. As I said, if you're in Jerusalem and you hold by the Jerusalem Rabbanut, or their system, or the rabbis, or local rabbi, that doesn't have kedusha, that's fine. What happens either if you're not in Jerusalem, you're in Bnei Brak or somewhere else, where you hold that system where the produce has kedusha? So I said that if the produce has kedusha, even the Arab produce, it's subject to these restrictions about trading. Now, for example, there was at least one store in the shuk which sold our produce, which had kedusha. Behold, it has kedusha. So how can I buy it? I'm not allowed to buy it by weight, because that's called trade. I'm not allowed to buy it by number, 7 apples or something. So I need some apples. Remember, I should only buy for what I need for a few days. I need some, I don't want to say apples, actually. Let's talk about vegetables. I want some potatoes, which were grown by Arabs, and I hold that that has kedusha. Now it's in a shop run by a Jew. How he got from the Arabs, let's leave that aside. But I hold that those potatoes have kedusha shmita, and I want some apples. I have to go to the store, and I pick and I put some apples in a bag. But in addition to some apples, I take a bottle of Coca-Cola. And I say, I want to buy the Coca-Cola and you'll include the cost of the apples, the approximate cost of the apples with the Coca-Cola. You're not to weigh it, and you're not to count them. You pick them up and you say, well, this is maybe about 7 shekels of potatoes, and the Coca-Cola, I don't know. I don't buy Coca-Cola. Let's say it's 12 shekels. So he says, I'll sell you the Coca-Cola with the apples included for 19 shekels. And therefore, when I have bought the Coca-Cola, included in the sale of the Coca-Cola are also the apples, which have not been weighed and they have not been counted, and they're sold by estimate. That is the classic way of buying produce which has kedusha shmita from a shopkeeper. That it's bought by what's called havlor, that is to say that the shmita produce is included in other produce, and I'm paying for that other produce, including the shmita. I don't weigh it, it's not counted, and it's included. It's even better that I don't pay for it in cash. Either he gives me credit because he knows me, or I'll give him a post-dated check. Presumably, credit card's the same thing. I'm not actually giving him cash, because then, as I said, the cash on the sale of the produce has kedusha, and that would be the ideal way of doing it. These days, I don't have to do that because there is another system to buy produce of Shmita without transgressing this Isur, this thing which is forbidden to trade. And that's called Otsa Beistim. Otsa means sometimes it means a treasure house or a warehouse. Well, I know it's like a treasure in a warehouse. So let me just read, very interesting, the source of this. The source of this is what's in the Tosefta, which is like a Mishnah in the Rosh Shmita. They say in the beginning, they were the agents of the Beis Din, Shluchei Beis Din, the agents of the Beis Din, Yoshvin al Pischei Ira, sitting at the gates of the cities. Kol mi shemevi perot b'tok yado, anyone who brought fruit in his hand, in other words, a farmer would pick some fruit and bring it to the town. No son mimenu. So the agents, the shluchim, the messengers, the officers of the Beis Din would take it from him, and they would give him in exchange food for 3 meals. In other words, he would bring a certain quantity of his fruit, and they would give him food, whatever food he needs, for 3 days. 3 meals, I'm sorry. And the rest that they took from him, they would give him back food for 3 days, and the rest they would put in what's called the otsa, the treasury, the supplies of the city. When the time for, let's say it was figs, were ripe, so the Beis Din would hire workers, and the workers would take out the figs, and maybe people then used to make what's called devela, like a crushed figs from the figs, and then they would put these crushed figs into the otsa, and then they would divide up the figs to all the people who needed it in the town. In other words, the Beis Din would be responsible for developing a system of distribution of the food. And this fits into what I said right at the beginning. We have 2 kinds of mitzvahs. We have mitzvahs on an individual. An individual has to put on tefillin. An individual has to eat matzah Pesach. And we have mitzvahs on the tzibur, on the community as a whole. I would say that certainly those mitzvahs like building the Beis HaMikdash, appointing a king, etc., are mitzvahs on the community. In my opinion, Shmitta is one of those mitzvahs where it applies to both, in both respects. There is a mitzvah on the mitzvahs on the individual to keep Shmitta in the positive way, it's a positive commandment, and in the negative way to avoid various things. And I think there is also a mitzvah on the community to arrange that people have what to eat. Of course, the Torah says, well, you can rely on me. The Almighty says there'll be enough to eat if you keep the Shmitta. But nevertheless, I believe that there is a responsibility, particularly, you see, if we say at the moment that Shmitta is not from the Torah, it's only from the rabbis. I said that depends on various views. One view, whether the majority of the Jews are living in Eretz Israel. In any event, I think that if it's only from the rabbis, there's a question maybe the Almighty doesn't guarantee. Maybe the Almighty only guarantees when Shmitta is from the Torah, you can rely on me. From the rabbis, if the rabbis want to make a law of Shmitta, so let the rabbis provide. That's possible. That's a possibility. So there is an obligation according to that for the community as a whole to see that there's enough to eat for the community. There's food available. Of course, some people, one of the systems which a lot of people use now is that they only bring in stuff from outside of Israel, from Syria, from Turkey. But you can't always get what you need or what you want, and maybe it's expensive, and some people only eat produce from outside of Israel, but some people will think, no, it's better to eat if it has Kedusha Shmita, whatever the Kedusha is. It's an indefinable spiritual thing, but maybe it's good to eat that. Good to eat that. I'm fulfilling the laws of Shmita. So what happens today? Now, I had said before that this law of Otsa Beis Din only applies to fruit of trees, because it's forbidden for a Jew to pick vegetables during the Shemitah year, because we are suspect that he may have planted during the Shemitah year. You're not allowed to plant. But you're allowed to eat, but you're not allowed to plant. So therefore, if I allow you to eat cucumbers, tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, I suspect that the people may have planted them in contravention to the law. So that's called svichim, and that is forbidden. So I had said that Otsa Beis Din, which is a way of distributing and selling fruit, principally would apply to fruit of trees, because the vegetables are forbidden. However, I have to modify that, because there is no issue, there's no prohibition on Arabs picking vegetables, because all these positive and negative mitzvahs only apply to Jews. There's no prohibition on Arabs picking vegetables. There's no prohibition on Arabs planting vegetables. However, if I hold, according to the B'nai Brak system, the Chazon Ish system that has Kedusha, there is going to be an Issa, a prohibition on Jews trading those vegetables. So therefore, the concept of Otzer Beis Din will avoid the prohibition of trading. And it will avoid the prohibition of trading both on fruit grown on fruit trees owned by Jews, because there's no prohibition on the Jew picking fruit. There's a prohibition on a Jew picking a vegetable because I suspect that he may have planted the vegetable that year. But there's no prohibition on him picking fruit from a tree, because there's no possibility that if he planted the tree that year, there would be fruit that year. So I'm not worried if I allow him to pick, I might cause him to plant. So therefore, I will now have two kinds of produce. I will have fruit of trees, which may be grown by Jews and Jewish land, and I have vegetables and the like, which may be grown by Arabs in Arab land. Now, how am I going to get away from the problem of trading? So therefore, I mentioned in brief the traditional, the classic example of Otzer Beis Din. So I'll tell you now how that's done. The Beis Din will now acquire the fruit of trees from Jews and vegetables from others. How will they acquire it? Because we said that Shmitta produce is ownerless, it's hefker. You don't own it. The Almighty, it belongs to the Almighty, and the Almighty is mafkrit for the Jewish people to eat. So therefore, the Otzer Beis Din can take possession of this produce. But wait a minute, a guy spent a lot of time looking after the land, tending if it's a tree and picking it, etc. And if it's vegetables from an Arab, they also worked planting and picking it. So the Beis Din is allowed to compensate them for the work that they did. The Beis Din can say to a man who's got an orchard of apples, oranges, listen, those oranges are all hefty. That means they're owners, and we're going to come and take them. But you spent a lot of time working and producing it, so we're going to pay you a fair sum for what you have done. Okay. Now the Beis Din are in possession of all this fruit. They've got to get it to the hands of individuals. So now they will say to shopkeepers and to distributors, you can't buy this fruit from us, but you can distribute it for us. And we will pay you a reasonable sum for distribution, for running your shop, for handling, etc. And then people can come in and they have to pay us, the Beis Din, a reasonable amount, because we've had to pay out the people who grew it, the people who distributed it, the people who run the shop. So therefore, let's say I have a kilo of, we're talking about apples. So that kilo of apples, I spent 3 shekels. I'm the Beis Din. We're the Beis Din. We spent 2 or 3 shekels to the which we gave to the farmer as compensation for his work in producing it. I gave a couple of shekels to the distributor. I had to pick it up and distribute it. I pay a couple of shekels to the person, the shop owner, because he has to get it in his shop and deliver it to people. And therefore, when I pay out 3 shekels here, 2 or 3 shekels here 2 shekels. Here, the thing is going to cost 8 shekels. So I'm going to tell the guy who wants to come and get the fruit, you're not going to buy it because it's hefker, but you can take it, but you have to pay 8 shekels as compensation for all the work and the money that the Beis Din has paid out. And even though you're going to pay the shopkeeper, you're not paying the shopkeeper because he's selling it to you. You're paying the shopkeeper because he is the agent of the Beis Din and he has to account to the Beis Din for the money he received. In that case, none of these provisions that I've said before about buying not by weight and not by number and there has to have law included in selling something else, none of those apply because you're not buying the fruit. And also the money does not have Kedushas Shmitta because it's not money paid for the produce. It's money paid for the distribution. And therefore, where I have a system of Otsa Beis Din, that means that the Beis Din manages the whole system of production and distribution of the food. And therefore, even though it has Shemitah's Beis Din, you're allowed to buy it. And therefore, even though I hold by the system of Bnei Brak, the Arab produce also has Kedusha, I can now buy produce as long as I know that it's sold by Otsa Beis Din. How would I know that? So again, I have to rely on the hechsher of the store. I am told, for example, that Rami Levi in the area where I live will only have Otsa Beis Din produce. In the past, they had things which were clearly marked. This is Otsa Beis Din. This is Nokri product. So you have to, again, be careful where you buy. If you buy in a store which specifically sells produce which has the hechsher, either Otsa Beis Din or the hechsher of the local rabbi, so then that's all right. But but you should not buy produce from a store which does not have a Shemitah hechsher. And as I said before, I do not recommend, but of course I'm not a posek, but I do not recommend that you buy produce which has heter mechil. And remember that even though I said there's no issue of trade on the produce of Otsa Beis Din, there is still the other law of Shemitah relating to the fact that you can't waste it or destroy it. You have to eat it in the normal way that it's eaten. You have to cook it in the normal way that it's eaten. You're not allowed to throw away. I've got to be clear about waste. I mean, we have to be tiny little bits, no. But if there's a substantial amount of food there, you can't throw it away. And that applies not only to the food itself, but if it's mixed up with other food. And you have to wait until it decomposes. I just want to go over this because that's very important, that it's better to have a couple of special containers where you put this fruit in, and when it's decomposed, you can throw it in the garbage. But you should have, I think, 2 containers, one for the different stages of decomposition. And as I've said, if someone is particularly sensitive and doesn't want to have decomposing food, then you should tie it up very well in plastic bags, and you could put it in the garbage, but try and put it on the side or at the top of it. Okay, so now one other thing that we do, which is a positive thing that we should do. Let's say I'm going to buy from a store, like where I live, the store will have Otsa Beis Din. And I'm buying from that store. Before the Shemitah year starts and before he buys produce from Beis Din, I will make him my shliach. I will make him my agent to collect and distribute the produce for him. So therefore, if he has 100 normally there would be a problem, even though he's only a distributor, not so keen on the idea that he gets 100 kilos of potatoes, because it looks, I mean, it looks as if it's like, and he's going to pay the distributor through the beis din tells him, but it doesn't seem right. So I will make him my shliach, my agent, for acquiring and distributing potatoes on my behalf. And therefore, if he has 100 customers who sign a piece of paper before the Shemitah year authorizing him to be their agent for acquiring it, so when he gets the 100 kilos of potatoes, it's not one quantity. He's getting a kilo for this person, a kilo for that person, a kilo for that person. And your store, if it is complying with the Shemitah law, will suggest to you at the beginning of the Shemitah year. I mean, the Shemitah year comes in on Rosh Hashanah, but the day after Rosh Hashanah, 2 days after Rosh Hashanah, there's not much stuff there that was picked after Rosh Hashanah. So you'll see that we have dates when each year it's slightly different according to the date when the product is known to be Shemitah. I have here in my book was from a previous Shemitah year, so it's telling me the dates for each produce, and there's every kind of fruit or every kind of vegetable is defined, and there's a date from which, you know, from that date the produce has a din of Shemitah, and also we're going to have another din of Biur, which we will explain, I think, next time. Okay, so that's very roughly the way you can get produce. You can get produce if you hold the Jerusalem system, you can get produce from the Arabs. If you hold by the B'nai system, you can get produce from a shop which has oats based in. If you're stuck, you can get produce from a shop, provided you buy it in, or you acquire it in this way of Havlah, that you buy other food which is not subject to Perah Shemitah, and that's included in that, and you don't have it weighed or measured, etc. You can buy produce that clearly comes from Chutz La'aretz. And again, you have to rely on a heksher, because people are in business, though. You can't rely on what someone says. But if there has a heksher that this comes from Turkey or this comes from France or whatever, so of course you can buy that. You can also buy produce which is grown in a way which is not liable to Shemitah. As I said, if it's grown in hot houses on tables with partitions and or hydroponic, and it's not considered Perus of Shemitah, then it doesn't even have these laws. It doesn't have the laws of not spoiling it, etc. But of course, you'll need to have hekshers on that. So basically, you can rely on that, and you have to, I suggest that you check out the shop that you normally buy your fruit and vegetables from, and in Shmitta, you're strict to go to that store and you buy that stuff. And that's, of course, not only fruit and vegetables. You're going to come into things like wine, you're going to come into olive oil, you're going to come into canned goods, very important canned goods, canned peas, canned carrots, stuff like that, canned chickpeas, if they're produce of Eretz Yisrael, so you'll have to make sure that they don't come from Shemitah year, or else that they have some other kinds of heksher, and that will be on the label. And this isn't relevant immediately after Rosh Hashanah, but for maybe the year or two afterwards, when you buy canned goods, you have to make sure on the label that they are not subject to Shemitah, because normally canned goods you pay for, you wouldn't go through. So you have to check all that very carefully. And that will affect also eating in restaurants, which I'll talk about another time. What I would like to do now also is one other thing, which is very relevant. Excuse me, just checking something. And that is flowers. What are the laws relating to flowers during the Shmitta year? So that depends. Flowers could be individual flowers like tulips, whatever, or they could be the flowering part of the bushes. That depends on whether the plant or the flowers are grown for fragrance or whether they are grown for beauty. Fragrance is considered, for this law at least, as something. If a plant has fragrance, so the fragrance itself is important, like the taste of the food. So the fragrance is important, and therefore the fragrance, the law of Shmitta attaches to flowers and flowering bushes, etc., that are grown for fragrance. When I was a bit younger, roses were always considered for fragrance. I don't know now if roses do have so much fragrance. But let's say that roses, for example, are grown for fragrance. If that's so, some other plant is grown for fragrance, flowers that are grown for fragrance. If that's so, they're subject to the laws of Shmitta. What does that mean? It means you're not allowed to pick them because they come under this general category of tzvichim, like vegetables. And therefore, I would suspect that maybe they were planted that year, unless they're flowering trees. But so if they are for fragrance, then I'm not allowed to pick them. What about if they are not for fragrance? Most flowers these days are not for fragrance, they're for decoration. So if they're in my own garden, I can pick them and cut them and put them on my table, etc., whatever I do, or Erev Shabbos, etc. What about buying flowers? Buying flowers that have fragrance? No. What about buying flowers that don't have fragrance? Well, that would be all right as long as they weren't planted that year. But you're not allowed to plant even flowers that don't have fragrance. So therefore, how do I know when I buy the flowers for Shabbos that those flowers are kosher and not subject to the laws of Shmitta? If they come from Kutzlaritz, that's all right. Tulips used to come from Holland, right? But nowadays, I think we import tulips to Holland. So you have to be careful. And therefore, I would say again that buying flowers during the Shmitta year, you should only buy them from a flower seller who has a hechsher that they are kosher, which means either they were not planted during the Shmitta year or they were perhaps grown in a way which was not on the ground. I should imagine you can grow flowers on tables in hothouses with partitions, etc., or based in oil or whatever. So again, flowers from your garden, if you're not planted them that year, okay. Cut, as long as they're not for fragrance, cut them and put them on your table. Flowers that you buy outside, you should only buy them from a source that you could rely on and know that they're kosher. And so for whatever matter, you don't have to worry about it. So I would say that in general, in practical terms, during the Shmitta year and afterwards, You should only buy produce from a store which has a recognized hechsher. And that will apply also not only buying, but I would say if you go out to eat, you should be very careful because the restaurant may not be strict on action. If it has a regular kashrut, that doesn't mean that they're strict on Shmitta, and they may rely on the heter mechira. Now, the heter mechira doesn't mean the food is forbidden. On the contrary, the food is permitted. There's nothing wrong with the food, but there's something wrong with the trading in it. And you don't want to be a party to that. And if you buy it, you're helping the person to circumvent the laws. And then there's all this problem of the money, which I told you, the money of has Kedusha. Let's say you go into a store which principally sells vegetables and food. And that store doesn't observe the laws of Shmitta. Okay, so you're not going to buy fruit, you're going to buy a can of Coca-Cola. But the majority of the trade in that store is from fruit and vegetables. So the can of Coca-Cola costs you 8 shekels. You give him 10 shekels, he gives you back 2 shekels change. The 2 shekels change that he gives you, where did you get that from? That was part of the 16 shekels, so the 17 shekels that he sold a few minutes ago to someone when he sold them a whole load of fruit and vegetables which had the Shemitah on. That means that that money that he got from that sale has Kedusha Shemitah. That means the 2 shekels change that he's given you for the can of Coca-Cola, all of a sudden that money has Kedusha Shemitah. And therefore you can only use that money to buy other produce. If you buy fish, that fish has Kedusha Shemitah. If you swap this fish for meat, the meat will have Kedusha Shemitah, not the fish. It transfers. But that will lead to all kinds of problems. So therefore, even a simple thing like going into a store and buying something which is not the fruit of Shemitah could create problems. Now, if the store is a big supermarket and it sells all kinds of stuff, so then I would say there's no problem with the change of 2 shekels because we go after the majority, and probably the majority of that money came from selling meat or fish or powdered or paper goods or whatever, and that's called bottled in life. But if it's specifically a store that sells fruit and vegetables, you have to be very careful, and particularly if you take money from them in change. Okay, well, I think that's a good, let me just summarize, because this is very important. What fruit and vegetables can I buy in Shmitta? If I hold by the Jerusalem system, I can buy Arab produce, no problem. I can buy certainly produce that comes from Kutzlaritz, from outside of the boundaries, and perhaps I can buy stuff which is like lettuce and things which are packaged, which are certified as having been grown in a way which doesn't have Kedusha. But Kedusha stuff, I can't buy it. It's forbidden to trade in it. So how do I get it? So the best way of getting it is through a store which has oats based in, which means, and you have to make sure that it's not an oats based in which is made up by 3 guys sitting in a bar saying, how are we going to get out of this problem? It's a respectable, accepted based in with an accepted hechsher. So therefore, I can buy my produce there, but it will be subject to the other rules. And as I said, that will also apply. You have to be very careful with flowers and things like that. Okay, so we'll continue next week with the law of Shiur, what that means and how we deal with that. And we'll see that.